Good morning, everybody, and thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to start by taking you on some field work on Google Earth. And we're going to start with the kind of place that Karen's been talking about. In fact, we're going to look at my address, my U.S. address, 5201 North Magnolia in Chicago, Illinois. And the imagery here is going to be relatively recent. It's about a year old. And we're at just under 1.2 kilometers of eye level here. And as you can see, the roads are all marked and named. And I can tell you that, over here you can see the gas station around the corner from me, adequately marked, as well as the Jewel, where I do my shopping. You can zoom in on this, and you can get to where you can see the details on the automobile, there's automobiles on the street and all kinds of stuff. And if you really want to do something exciting, you can drag this little guy over here and let him go. And you'll end up on my corner, and you can pan around here, and this is my building. And I know that it really looks like you can get up there and peek in the window, but you can't, because this is not reality. This is just a lot of really detailed information, okay? And in comparison, what I want you to look at next is we're going to go to Budadiri, Uganda. Now, I don't have an address for this because they don't use addresses on the ground in Budadiri. In fact, they don't even have a post office. And as you can see, there's only one road that's marked, and it's the Namusi Budadiri Road. It's an earth road. It's highly eroded, and it washes out very easily when it rains, which is most of the time. If you try to get, you can see maybe one place is marked, and it gives you some idea of, if I can get it to come up here, what things look like on the ground. In addition to no post office, there's no bank, there's no internet cafe. Most people don't have electricity. Most people don't have plumbing. And if you try to get as close as we got in Chicago, you're just going to start getting a blur, and that's not because there's nothing down there. It's because there's no data. And I'm going to talk to you about two ladies who live down in the town, but then I'm also going to talk to you about three ladies who live, I don't think that was me, up here on this mountain, all right? And up on that mountain, there's no light at night, and only the most powerful men have cell phones. That we have a real lack of data on the way women do entrepreneurship in developing countries. And even though that gen data that you just looked at says it covers Uganda, and the reality is that this area and areas like it probably were not reached by the data collectors. And even if they were, it was in such small numbers that we can't say anything about the people on the ground with any clarity. I'm often criticized by people saying, oh, well, you're only talking about outliers that nobody really cares about. So I want to remind you that the largest chunk of the people in the world population still live in the rural areas of developing nations, that it's the people in this room who are the outliers and not the ladies on my screen. And that, in fact, there are several major institutions represented in this room who are spending a great deal of money trying to help the women on the ground here and in other places like Budadiri, Uganda. And so it's important for us to get a better idea not only of what these people look like, but whether the questions we're asking are the right ones. I'm going to begin with Beatrice. Beatrice lives up on that mountain that I just showed you. And like everyone up there, she's basically in agriculture. And like all the women, she essentially just tries to squeeze a living out of the things she can grow from her home garden. She bears the same agricultural risks as everybody else, but she also, like actually the other women up there, she has an infrastructural exposure that's a problem, and that's the road that I talked about. It's very rough. There's no public transportation. And so what she has to do to get her produce to market is she has to hire one of these truck drivers that shuttle up and down to the valley. And these guys have figured out that they've got a captive market with people with perishable inventory, and they gouge accordingly. So it's a huge aspect of her cost structure is this high variability and a very high cost of transportation. So I heard this problem so much that I asked Beatrice, I said, so Beatrice, if an angel were to give you a truck, what would you do with it? And she said, well, I'd ask my husband to learn to drive it. And that's because driving is a guy thing, here and in most of the rest of the developing world in my observation. Women are not expected to do that, and they're not expected to travel far from home very often either. In fact, they're supposed to stay home, take care of children. Beatrice is lucky because she only has 2. The average in Uganda is between 5 and 6. And she's supposed to, try to figure out to make, with her feminine skills, ways to make a living. So that I kept thinking, well, much like my grandmother, what she should be doing is trying to make sauces or chutneys or jams or jellies or something that will help her to have a value-added product. The problem is this is her kitchen. It's actually a pretty good kitchen as these things go, and it's new. But perhaps you can see that there's just a circle of 3 or 4 small stones in the middle. That's her stove. She doesn't have much control over the heat or the flame. She does it in open wind and rain, and so it's not a very controllable situation. The spices available in the area are only the ones that are locally grown, so there's not much variation. And frankly, I don't know where Beatrice would get a jar to sell salsa in. So there are really some material scarcity constraints on what Beatrice can achieve, and that's really important to bear in mind. She's really lucky because she has a really good husband, and they work as a team, and they've built this house that has good walls and a good roof and windows that shut and a door that locks. He runs what's called a boda business, which just means that he has a motorcycle that he rents and he uses it as a taxi service. The problem is that boda drivers die young. So she's got a big marital risk here. And so I asked her, what about that house? What would happen if your husband were to be killed? Now the problem is that under statutory law in Uganda, she would be able to inherit this property. But that's really a very distant influence in Beatrice's world. And what really is going to happen on the ground is that they're going to follow traditional practice, which would give her husband's brothers the right to come in and take all of her property and force her to marry one of them just to keep her children from going hungry. And it's a polygamous society, so they can do this as many times as necessary. And I asked her, well, what about this? And she said, oh, they wouldn't dare. Now, I hope she's right, but her best chance of making that wish come true is her connection to the rest of the community and the degree to which they will support her should that happen. And a key part of her community connections is a women's group of which Janet is a member. This was originally a singing group, but they were told, they learned that there was going to be a government-held training session in forming microfinance groups, and they pulled their funds several years ago and sent Janet down to learn how to do it. They sent Janet because she has 2 years of secondary school education, which makes her the most educated person. And she came back and she told them how to set up a group that is basically a combination of microfinance, savings, and profit-sharing organization. And every week they all come in and everybody, as much as possible, pays in their money in cash, and then it's loaned immediately back out, and so that everybody can see and feel the cash as it's coming and going. So I asked her, I said, well, what about banking? Why are you not banking? We all know, right? Women need to bank. She says, well, it's like 3 hours into the nearest bank. It would cost this much, and then I'd have to pay the fee and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't make any sense. And I had to agree that she was right, that was a first world prejudice of mine. All right, but at the same time, I also really could observe that the transparency of doing all this in cash was really important because most of the people in her group are barely literate and barely numerate. And so it helps a lot in terms of incurring trust. Now, Janet has better market access than most people. She has a restaurant, which she's standing in front of in this picture, and it's on a road in this market town, which isn't much to write home about. But it's about 3 buildings just like this, and people walk in from around the area once a week on Tuesdays to do their trading. And they usually stay all day long, and that means they need to be fed. And this makes an opportunity for Janet to sell them lunch, which she makes on a stove that looks worse than Beatrice's. And she has a neighbor right down in the same shopping strip named Grace. Grace is essentially a microbrewer, and her husband has a farm that he can provide water and maize with which she can brew her beer, and then she sells it in this tavern that she's built up that sells beer to the men who come into trade. Now, the truth of the matter is that her husband owns the land, and therefore he owns all of the output from the land. Under Ugandan practice, he owns all of Grace's earnings. But she's lucky. She has a good husband, too. And so he lets her have control over her own earnings, and that means that she can then share them with the rest of the group. So everybody benefits from Grace's good fortune. The thing that they don't benefit from is what Grace is selling. What she's got, this is the pot in Grace's tavern. It's got the homebrewed beer in it, and the men come around in a very, very predictable ritual every evening, and they suck the beer up through these tubes. They were really surprised when I walked in and took this picture. We all laughed when all 6 feet of white me came in there. Anyway, it was a funny moment. Anyway, but what the problem with it is that a lot of family income is being sucked up through those tubes, right? And a lot of those men go home drunk, and they get violent, and some of them become alcoholics. And this is not just Grace's problem, obviously. It's a problem throughout this entire valley and through this whole region. Now, Catherine lives down in the town. Catherine is a natural leader, and so she organized her own microfinance group according to her own scheme. She can do this because she finished senior high school. She's an educated woman, and she's married to a teacher, which is the only form of formal employment I have ever seen in this area. And he's a very forward-thinking man, and so he doesn't mind if she takes the bus from time to time into the nearest big city. And of course, since she, unlike most women, has her own cell phone, if she has a problem, she can call him and tell him. When she goes into the city, she's able to go to an internet cafe where she can learn how to manage businesses online, and she can learn how to take care of livestock. And so she now has a thriving poultry business, and she owns 2 cows, which is a significant measure of wealth in this community. She's also opened a bank account for her microfinance group so that she's able to report back to them quarterly and show them the statements of what's been happening. The problem is that the rest of the women in her group are mostly women who own fruit and vegetable stands along that big road I showed you, just like this one. And what they do is they buy produce that comes down from the mountain from those guys that gouge the women uphill, and they gouge the women downhill too. So they have a very narrow margin, and they have a perishable inventory. These women have a very hard time holding on to their earnings because they have issues with their husbands. They're not particularly numerate, and so what happens is they borrow over and over again, and when Catherine shows them the statements every quarter, they really don't understand it. So a lot of them are caught in a downward credit spiral. This is Rose. I stay at Rose's Bed and Breakfast when I go there because it has plumbing. Even though it doesn't have hot water, it does have flush toilets. It has more or less reliable electricity, so at the end of the day you can have an ice-cold Coca-Cola, well, maybe not ice-cold, and beer in a branded bottle. So it's a great place. And it happened because 25 years ago, Rose recognized that the hikers that were coming through Budadiri on the way to explore Mount Elgon needed a place to stay. And she showed remarkable initiative by doing things like staying up nights so she could rent out her own room and make money on it. And eventually, she built it into a business, and she's now probably the richest woman for miles. How do you account for this? I hate to say it because it's a lame excuse, but you can tell right away that Rose is an entrepreneurial personality. But it's also important to recognize that Rose never married, and she has no children. So she's been able to control her own finances. What she has done is she's taken in a lot of HIV orphans, and many of you may realize that Uganda has been torn by genocide and a wave of HIV that has been devastating. And she has raised and fed and educated some of these kids, and they've helped her with her business. She's also, I have to admit, a transgressive personality too. The land that she's standing on here is hers. And the story of how she came to own that land is a long one, but it basically is a testimony to the shrewdness of Rose's strategy. And she has to be shrewd because this is an area where women just simply don't own land. But we should be expecting, in fact, that those two things would occur together. This willingness to be transgressive, to break the rules, even the gender rules, and an entrepreneurial personality. So the questions that I'm suggesting then that we might want to ask that would be different, or the circumstances that are a bit different, is first of all, this whole issue of entrepreneurship status in an area where there's no other employment and the risk of daily life is more than most of the rest of us could tolerate. Where we worry about innovation in an area where material scarcity and infrastructure are probably the biggest drags and not imagination and guts. These are people who are making an impact and a contribution if they do nothing more than feed children in an area that is otherwise potentially unstable. But they manage, even though they're necessity entrepreneurs, to achieve social outcomes as well, and it's important to give them that credit. There are still some similarities as well. There's the importance of family. It's a motivation for sure in this area, but it's also a constraint. The quality of relationships that's really important, but it's the quality and not just the existence. It's whether you have a good husband or a husband who drinks. But it's also about the quality of the relationships you have with other women, how much they'll support you, and how much equality you have with them. I do want to raise the issue of gender norms. The GEM survey asks questions about media as a source of gender norms, and I just want to say these folks have no media, but they're up to here with gender stereotypes. I also want to point out the way that gender poses concrete constraints for these women. It's not just a figment of their imagination, and that it's part of the different opportunities and the different risks that they face as women that makes their business life different from men. And finally, I just want to point to the potential for entrepreneurship to be a form of emancipation. And this, if for no other reason, we should be pursuing it for as many people as we can.